Time now, 9:13. Well, new stats are out on traffic stops in Missouri. This report is coming from the Attorney General's office, and it shows black people in Missouri are 75% more likely to be pulled over than white people. And these are stats from 2014. Looking at Columbia, black drivers were nearly twice as likely to be pulled over than white people. And joining me today to talk more about this report is Columbia Police Chief Ken Burton. First off, thanks so much for coming on. We always appreciate you being here. Well, Chief, you hear those stats, and it can be startling. What's your take on this report that's just out?
Well, I think you have to be careful because the data that's collected by itself does not mean anybody's racially profiling. There are a lot of other factors that you have to add in, and what we use it for is to look at where we might have issues. But we're very careful not to make any drawing conclusions from those numbers because they really don't go deeply enough into the data that can be collected.
Yeah, and what all are some factors that go into that?
Oh, time of day, day of week, part of the city. I mean, where your criminal activity is occurring, is going to factor in, and you've got to look at where the where the traffic stops are occurring, and when they're occurring, and why they're occurring, and none of that is brought out in the data that's given to the Attorney General.
Why is it something that they collect every year? Just kind of a requirement? And, is there anything that they do on a state level?
As far as the state of Missouri, I'm not sure. I do know that where I come from back in Texas, this started back in the late 80s, early 90s, there was believed to be a disparity in the number of African-American drivers versus white drivers and Hispanic drivers. And so states just started collecting that data. So it's something that I think is, like I said, it gives us a good starting point to look at issues within the department, but I'm always careful not to draw any conclusions from those numbers.
Yeah, and Attorney General Chris Koster, whose report this office whose office this report came from, he even said that these stats, they don't prove law enforcement. They're making stops based on perceived race or ethnicity of a driver. Do you think sometimes people can look at that and say, well, it seems that way based on the numbers?
Well, sure. I think that anytime you say, okay, this group is more than twice the number of times, you could say that, but again, I said I wouldn't draw any conclusions. I would just look at the data overall, and we do look at it much more deeply.
Do you think it's maybe even some changes in terms of when they put out this report that they maybe could make so the public has more availability to all factors that go into these numbers?
It is just so cumbersome. There's so many agencies that just don't have the time or the resources to do it. We don't most of the time, but we do force the issue and look at areas where we might be able to improve.
Yeah, and it's something that you guys always do put out. It's always something you abide by in terms of that requirement that they have.
That's correct.
Well, kind of moving on to a different report that came out last month. You guys kind of put it out. It was on downtown cameras. These cameras were approved by voters in 2010, and they're not monitored all the times. And in the police department's report that was put out, you kind of stated that the current effectiveness of these cameras is kind of hindered by their limited number and deployment. Kind of elaborate on that.
Well, there's just a few of them downtown in a certain area, and as you said, we don't monitor them. I don't know if you recall back in 2010 there was a public discussion about whether or not we should monitor them all the time. And it was concluded at that time that they did not want the police just simply monitoring these cameras for people that are engaging in otherwise lawful activity. So we don't. We use them as a tool after the fact. When there's a crime that occurs, we can look at the cameras to see if we can detect who the suspect might be or what actually occurred, and that's how we use them.
Do you feel like they might be more effective if there are more, or if you had the manpower to put more people on them?
Absolutely. I think if people that are aware of them, that are going to engage in criminal activity, you're not going to do it in front of the camera. And it's like I said back in 2010, I think they're more of a deterrent than anything else, but they're only a deterrent in a very, very small area. If you take the city of London, England, for instance, they're all over the city. So they become a greater deterrent then because people don't know where all the cameras are, and there's a reasonable assurance on their part that they're going to be photographed or filmed at least if they're engaging in criminal activity. So the more widespread they are, the more effective they are, but also the more expensive they are. So,
Yes, certainly.
And they're very costly.
Yeah. Do you think it would have to be something that would have to go back to the voters too? Because I remember covering the story many years ago with
Right,
you
yeah.
when I was covering it, that there was some concern about privacy. Do you think that would have to be another issue that we'd maybe have to talk about with the community?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we could never just say we're going to do this without community input. And to be very frank with you, I don't think it will happen here. I think what we have, we're lucky to have, and we use them to the extent that we can.
Yeah. And do you think anything will change, or is there anything you guys could do different with the cameras, the police department?
No, other than monitoring them all the time, which the community clearly does not want us to do, using them the way we're doing right now is about the best we can do.
Well, I think that's all I have for you today. Packed a lot in today.
Yeah.
As always, thanks so much for coming on.
My pleasure.
We appreciate it. Now here's Brittany with a look.